They called it mercy when they switched off the last survivor's translator and let the silence fall. Commander Vera Solis heard it happen from 3 decks below, not the silence itself, but the absence of the voice that had been pleading through the hull for 11 hours. She was elbow-deep in a coolant manifold at the time, grease on her chin, the emergency lighting turning everything the color of old rust. She set down her wrench. She did not move for a long moment. Then she picked the wrench back up and kept working. That was the thing about Vera Solis. She kept working. The cradle station had been human-built from the bones of a decommissioned ore freighter, bolted and welded into the Jovian shadow, at the edge of the shipping lanes where the Vareth Conclave had decided, politely, and then impolitely, that humanity did not belong. 3 years ago, the Conclave had established what they called an exclusion meridian, a border drawn in space using the math of species they had decided were senior. Humanity in their taxonomy was not senior. Humanity was provisional. Humanity was. The word the Vareth used was something that translated as ungerminated, meaning a seed that had not yet proven it would grow into something worth the soil it displaced. Vera had been provisional for 3 years. She was tired of it. The station had 16 people on board when the Vareth enforcement cruiser arrived. It had 16 people on board still. She'd done the count herself, twice. But one of them, Yusef Okafor, had been on the outer hull trying to reattach a communications array when the cruiser's scanning pulse swept the station like a searchlight. He'd been knocked loose. The magnetic tether had caught him 8 meters out. He'd hung there in the dark for 11 hours, broadcasting on the emergency channel, while the Vareth cruiser sat at 200 kilometers and decided what category of incident this was. They had decided, negligible. Vera had the station's one working laser cutter, 3 people who understood propulsion engineering, a medical officer named Dr. Piotr Haas, who had worked in xenocomparative biology for 20 years before the exclusion, and a stolen data core pulled from a Vareth transit hub that nobody on the station entirely understood. She also had a plan that she had not told anyone about yet, because she was not entirely sure it wasn't going to kill every single one of them. She figured that made her about even with the Vareth Conclave. Haas found her in the manifold bay at hour 3 of the repair. He was a compact man with precise hands and a habit of standing with his arms folded behind his back like he was always about to deliver a lecture he'd been preparing for years. He had, in fact, been preparing the same lecture for years. "You're thinking about the data core again," he said. "I'm thinking about the coolant manifold. You've fixed that manifold 4 times this week. You fix it when you're thinking." She pulled her hands out of the housing and looked at them. Both gloves were shot through with translucent stains. The data core tells us how the Vareth transfer neural mapping between biological substrates. It's in the medical partition, the part we cracked 6 months ago. You've read it. I've read it. It's not human medicine, Vera. No. But the principle is the principle. She stood, rolling her shoulders. What they're doing out there, Haas, that cruiser sitting at 200 clicks while Yusuf hung on a tether, that's not enforcement. That's a message. The message is, we don't have to hurry for you. You are not urgent to us. Haas looked at the far wall for a moment. This was his tell, the faraway look that meant he was running numbers he didn't want to run. And the plan. The plan. She wiped her hands. We use what's in the data core. We give them something they didn't expect. We stop being provisional. He was quiet a long time. What I know about Vareth neural transfer, he said at last carefully, is that they use it as continuity. Their senior commanders, when their biological forms are damaged beyond repair, they transfer the cognitive map to a prepared substrate. They carry their minds through catastrophe. They find it, I believe the word is sacred. He unfolded his arms, folded them again. I also know that their enforcement protocols carry a very specific prohibition. They will not engage a station or vessel that presents as a medical facility conducting neural transfer. The prohibition is absolute. Cultural, not tactical, Vera nodded slowly. Because to interfere with transfer is to kill something they consider immortal. Yes. So if we were, in their instruments reading, conducting a neural transfer operation on this station, they would be compelled to withdraw to a non-interference distance of no less than 50,000 kilometers and request guidance from the conclave sanctum, which takes 11 days minimum. Stand conclave deliberation. She almost smiled. Long enough for us to push through to the relay beacon at Callisto margin and get a message to Earth fleet. Haas didn't say anything for a while. The cooling systems wheezed. Somewhere above them, recycled air moved through ducts that had never been quite right. There are 2 problems, he said. Tell me. First, The transfer signature they'll detect on scan needs to be authentic. The data core gives us the electromagnetic profile of a genuine Verith procedure. I can replicate it if I have access to the medical bay's neural induction hardware and approximately 40 hours to build the broadcast scaffold. But it needs a subject. A human neurological pattern running through the array, something for the scan to actually read. A blank array reads as a blank array. Vera absorbed this. And the second problem, Haas said quietly, is Carl. She closed her eyes. Carl Fenwick was 26 years old and had been on Cradle Station since the beginning because there was nowhere else for him to go. The degenerative nerve condition he'd been born with had progressed through 3 surgeries and 2 experimental treatments and had reached, 18 months ago, what the Earthside specialists called plateau, which was the medical profession's kind word for the place where they stopped being able to help you. He used a powered brace on his left leg. His left hand had tremors that came and went. He ran diagnostics on the station's sensor array because it was work he could do sitting down, and he did it better than anyone Vera had ever seen. And he never complained. And every few weeks she would find him sitting alone in the observation bay, looking at Jupiter's cloud bands, with an expression she had learned not to interrupt. He had heard about the data core. He had, in fact, been the one to crack the medical partition. He came to her that night, or a Watt Fortin on the station, the lights cycling down to 30% to give human circadian rhythms something to hold on to. He knocked at the door of her quarters, which she was using as a planning space, and she could tell from the way he knocked, 4 deliberate raps, evenly spaced, that he already knew what she was going to ask him. Haas explained the technical requirements, he said. "Sit down, Carl, I'd rather stand." She looked at him. He was leaning on the doorframe, his brace humming very quietly, his right hand in his pocket and his left at his side. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did, the careful composure of someone who'd had a long time to practice not letting the fear show. "You cracked that partition 6 months ago," she said. "You've been reading it ever since." "Yes." The data core describes a subsequent transfer technique, what the Verith call continuity transfer. "You've read the human-compatible variant theory that Haas wrote up." "I've read it." He paused. "It's theoretical. Haas says it's more than theoretical. He says the mechanics are sound if the induction scaffold is built correctly. He says the risk is non-trivial." Carl looked at the floor. That's the word he used with me too. Non-trivial. He said it like he was tasting something he wasn't sure about. What it means, in plain language, is that there's a real chance the mapping process damages the existing neural structure. What it means is that it might not work. What it also means is that if it does work. He stopped. Vera waited. "All my life I've been something people stared at," he said. "At best, something they pitied. At worst," he made a small gesture with his right hand. "But what you're proposing isn't a cure, Commander. It's a demonstration. You need the scan to read as authentic. You need me in the array for 40 hours while Haas runs the broadcast scaffold. And maybe it does something to the mapping. Maybe it doesn't. I'm a prop." "You're not. I'm not saying that unkindly." He looked up at her, and his eyes were very clear, the way eyes get when someone has thought something all the way through to the end. "I'm saying I've spent a lot of years being the thing the procedure is performed on. I know what that feels like. I just want to know if this time it has a point. A real one. Not, you'll be helping everyone in the way that people say that when they mean they need something from you." Vera looked at him for a long time. "Yusuf is dead," she said. "The Verith made that decision in the time it takes to run a diagnostic. 11 hours. They didn't deliberate. They didn't consult their sanctum. They just decided. That's what provisional means to them. It means your life has a value they can calculate and discard in an afternoon." She leaned forward. "I want them to hesitate. I want to make them uncertain for 11 days. Long enough for Earth Fleet to hear us. Long enough for this station and everyone on it to matter to someone with guns." She paused. "That's the point. That's the real one." Carl was quiet for a very long time. "Then Haas says the scaffold takes 40 hours to build. Yes, he'll need the sensor array offline during construction. I'll have to reroute nav passives to secondary. Can you do that?" "Yes." He pushed off the doorframe, his brace adjusting to the shift of weight. "I'll need access to the medical bay's tertiary processor. And I want Mira in the room, the whole time." Mira Chen was the station's pilot, and also Carl's closest friend in the way that friendships formed on isolated stations sometimes did. Not from choice, but from the specific gravity of shared confinement becoming, over time, something that felt like being known. "Done," Vera said. He nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. Commander. Yeah, I'm not doing this because I think it will fix anything, my condition. I know what the literature says and what Haas hopes, and I know the difference. He said it without bitterness, just accuracy. I'm doing it because Yusef was my friend, and nobody hesitated when they let him die. He left. Vera sat in the dark and listened to the station breathe. The Vareth enforcement cruiser was called in its own language, something that translated roughly as certainty of precedent. It had been on station in the Jovian exclusion zone for 14 months, and its mission commander, a senior-grade Vareth called Coordinator Veth Anassel, had processed 207 human incidents in that time. Unauthorized transit, unlicensed signal broadcast, boundary encroachment. The incidents were to Veth Anassel administrative matters. They were filed, they were resolved, they were forgotten. The one the humans called the Cradle Station was by any measure the same. He had noted the casualty event with the outer hull worker. He had noted it the way you noted a pressure reading, as data. The humans had been told the exclusion meridian was established. They had been told the enforcement protocols were active. They had been told repeatedly, and in every language their translation software could produce, that the Conclave did not regard their presence as an emergency requiring immediate response. They had not listened. This was the characteristic failure mode of ungerminated species. They proceeded as if their urgency was shared. Veth Anassel did not share their urgency. He was in the command center when the scan return changed. The sensor operator, a junior-grade Vareth named Kess who had been trained to regard humans as slightly more significant than debris, went very still. Veth Anassel had known Kess for 6 years and knew what the stillness meant. Report, he said. Coordinator. Kess's voice carried the specific quality of something uncertain about whether it was reading the instruments correctly. The human station. We're detecting a neural transfer signature. The command center went quiet in a way that command centers do not usually go quiet. Classification, Veth Anassel said. His own voice was entirely neutral. He was very good at keeping his voice neutral. Vareth Protocol Electromagnetic Profile. The scaffold architecture matches a continuity transfer procedure. Stage 2 of 4. Kess ran the reading again, ran it a third time. Coordinator, there is an active neural map in the array. Veth Anassel stood. He stood because he was a coordinator of the Vareth Conclave. And he had been trained from the first year of his service that the prohibition against interfering with continuity transfer was not a rule. Rules could be weighed. The prohibition was a fact of his civilization the way gravity was a fact of his biology, foundational structural, not subject to situation. To interrupt a continuity transfer was to kill the consciousness undergoing it. To kill a consciousness in transfer was, in Vareth understanding, to kill something that was in the act of becoming permanent. It was the single act the Conclave would not forgive. But the humans, he stopped himself, it didn't matter. What mattered was the reading. What mattered was that his instruments were showing him a genuine scaffold, a genuine neural signature, a genuine transfer procedure, being conducted on that station. What mattered was the prohibition. Withdraw to non-interference distance, he said. 50,000 kilometers. Inform the sanctum. He paused. Request guidance. Kess hesitated. Coordinator the humans. 50,000 kilometers, Veth Anassel said. Now. Certainty of precedent began to move. On the station, Murachen was the first to see it on the navigation display. She was in the medical bay, as agreed, as Carl had asked. Sitting in the chair closest to the induction array, watching Carl's face through the transparent panel of the scaffold housing. He was awake. He was under mild sedation but awake, because Haas had insisted on maintaining conscious monitoring throughout. And Carl had agreed to it in the flat, practical way. He agreed to things that were going to be hard. His eyes were open and looking at the ceiling. Mira had known Carl for 2 years. She had played cards with him, 3 nights a week, in the observation bay, with Jupiter rotating behind them like a slow thought. She knew how he held his cards when he had a good hand, loosely with deliberate carefulness, like he was trying not to want it too much. She knew the specific quality of his humor, which was dry enough to be mistaken for seriousness. Until you caught the quarter smile that came just after the delivery. She knew that he had, on the station's shared music server, a playlist labeled simply with a year, 2039, the year his mother had died. That he played sometimes late in the station's night, quietly enough that it didn't carry through the bulkheads. She watched the navigation display. She watched certainty of precedence return signature begin to move. Carl, she said quietly. His eyes moved toward her through the panel. It's working, she said. They're pulling back. His expression didn't change right away. Then it did. Something releasing in his face. Something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite relief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. He lifted his right hand very slightly from the housing surface. Mira put her hand against the panel, palm flat, the way you reach toward someone when glass is in the way. Above them, in the corridor, she could hear Vera Solis beginning to move toward the communications array. She could hear the footsteps quicken. 40 hours. They had 40 hours before the scaffold needed to be maintained or powered down. 40 hours before the Verith read any change in the signal and began to question what they were seeing. In that 40 hours, the Callisto relay was 12 hours away at the station's best push. An Earth fleet response, if the message reached the right desk, if the right people were listening, could be on station in 9 days, which meant it would work, or it wouldn't, with a margin of 1 day. Vera Solis ran the math and ran it again, and decided that 1 day was more than provisional. The message she composed was not long. She was not a naturally eloquent person. She wrote the kind of sentences that moved in straight lines, subject, verb, object, and she did not apologize for it. She gave the coordinates. She gave the situation. She gave the name of the enforcement cruiser and its current position. She said, "We have 11 people, and we have bought ourselves 11 days." She said, "Yusuf Okafor is dead and you need to know his name." She said, "We are still here." She sent it at hour 14, riding a tight beam through the gap in the Verith sensor coverage, that the 50,000-kilometer withdrawal had opened. She sent it twice. She did not tell anyone she'd sent it until it was done, because she was the kind of commander who believed in presenting facts, rather than hopes. Then she went back to the medical bay and sat down next to Mira and waited. Haas did not sleep. In the hours that followed the withdrawal, he moved between the scaffold controls and his own terminal, with the precise, unhurried motion of someone engaged in work he believed in. This was the thing about Haas that people misread. They looked at his careful manner and his folded arms, and they thought detachment. But Vera had watched him, over 3 years, work through 3 separate near-catastrophic system failures. And she knew that what looked like detachment was actually the opposite. It was the way very invested people behaved when they could not afford to let the investment show. He cared about the work with a ferocity that would have burned through his composure if he'd let it out. He had never, in 20 years of xenocomparative medicine, had the chance to attempt anything like what the data core described. He had read the partition 6 months ago, and he had understood immediately, with the specific gut certainty that real scientists get and almost never talk about, that the theory was correct. Not promising, not interesting, correct. The architecture was different from human neurological mapping, in ways that were profound, and ways that were superficial. And the superficial differences were the ones that previous human researchers had fixated on. The ones that had made the whole field seem alien and untranslatable. The profound differences were actually simpler, more elegant. The Verith had solved a problem humans had been approaching from entirely the wrong angle. He hadn't told anyone this for 6 months, because the only responsible thing to do with a paradigm shift was to sit with it until you were sure. He was sure now. He watched Carl's neural signature on the array monitors. Steady, present, the pattern that was specifically and entirely Carl Fenwick, rendered in waveform. And he ran the scaffold at parameters he had calculated to the limit of what the induction hardware could sustain. He was not simply faking a Verith procedure, he was running it. Modulated for human neurological architecture, translated across the gap between their biology and humanities, with the patience of someone who had spent 6 months understanding that gap from the inside out. Whether it worked, in the sense that Carl meant when he'd said it wouldn't fix anything, Haas genuinely did not know. The mapping process was doing something. What it was doing would not be clear until Carl was out of the housing and conscious, and they had time to assess. At hour 31, the navigation display showed certainty of precedent holding at 52,000 kilometers. The Verith hadn't moved. The Sanctum hadn't responded yet. 11 days, standard deliberation. Vethanasal was somewhere out in the dark, waiting for guidance on a situation he did not understand and could not classify, and therefore could not resolve. Vera found herself thinking about that. About what it felt like to be an instrument of a system and encounter something the system hadn't taught you to categorize. She didn't feel sorry for Vethanasal exactly, but she understood him a little, and understanding him made her angrier in a way she hadn't expected. Because he wasn't cruel, she thought. He had let Yusuf die not from cruelty but from certainty. He had been certain of what category of thing Yusuf was. He had never needed to question it. She wondered what he was feeling now, sitting at 52,000 kilometers, with a sanctum that wasn't answering. She hoped it was uncertainty. She hoped it was the specific productive discomfort of a worldview encountering something it hadn't budgeted for. At hour 38, Carl spoke. He spoke through the scaffold's intercom, his voice slightly flat from the sedation, but entirely his own. Mira, who had been asleep in the chair by the panel, came awake immediately. She had the sailor's gift for sleeping shallow when the situation required it. I'm right here. I can feel my hand, Carl said. A pause. Which hand? Mira said very carefully. Left. Another, I can feel it. I could always feel it. But the tremor is...
Stopped.
It stopped. Mira stood up so fast the chair scraped back. She put her hand on the panel. Haas, she called, her voice pitched to carry through the bay. Haas, come in here. Haas came in with his arms already unfolded, which meant he'd been listening. He moved to the monitors with the controlled urgencies of someone who had been waiting for a result for 6 months and was not going to let excitement corrupt the observation. He read the display for a long moment. Then he sat down, which was something Vera had never seen him do in a moment of professional intensity. Carl, he said very quietly, I need you to tell me what you're experiencing, in as much detail as you can. Carl described it. He described it with the same careful accuracy he brought to diagnostics, running through the sensory inventory of his own body, with the patience of someone who had learned, over many years, to pay close attention to the difference between what he wanted to be true and what was actually happening. His voice was steady. He said, the tremor is gone. He said, the left leg feels different. I don't know how else to say it. Different in a way that might be important, he said. I'm not going to get excited about it yet because I've been disappointed before. But his voice, even being careful, had something in it. Something that lived just underneath the careful part. Haas listened to all of it. He took notes in the thorough, illegible handwriting of someone who writes faster than they think. When Carl finished, Haas sat for a moment with his pen hovering over the pad, and then he said, very precisely, the mapping process appears to have functioned as a corrective analog to the degenerative damage in the peripheral motor pathways. The scaffold may have, I don't want to use the word repaired, because that implies a finished state, and we don't know the finished state. But the pathway architecture in the waveform is different from your baseline measurably, significantly. Carl didn't say anything for a while. Then, how significantly? Haas looked at the display again. He looked at it for a long time. I don't have a human comparison point, he said. This has never been done before. I need to run extensive assessment. I need weeks, possibly months, of careful Peter. Haas stopped. Carl had used his first name, which was unusual enough to make Haas go quiet. How significantly, Carl said again. Haas set down his pen. I think, he said slowly, that you may be significantly better than you were this morning. The bay was very quiet. The scaffold hummed. Somewhere outside, 50,000 kilometers away, a Verith cruiser held its position and waited for guidance that wasn't coming yet. Mira was crying, though she would have disputed the word. She would have said she had something in her eye. Her hand was still on the panel. Vera, standing in the doorway, she had come in at hour 35 without announcing herself, looked at the monitor showing certainty of precedent's position, and then at the monitor showing Carl's neural waveform, and she thought about a man named Yusuf, who had hung on a tether for 11 hours, while something large and certain decided he wasn't urgent. She thought about what provisional meant and what it cost. She thought about a civilization that had drawn a border in space and written humanity on the wrong side of it. She thought, we are still here. On day 9, Earth Fleet Rapid Response Unit Achilles emerged from a transit corridor at the outer edge of the Jovian Shadow, followed in sequence by Aro Leonidas, Aro Verdun, and the command vessel F's Meridian Break, which carried aboard it Admiral Yuki Osi and a diplomatic team with full conclave negotiation credentials. The fleet formation was not technically a combat posture. It was what the Verith would classify as a presence assertion, a demonstration of what they called weight, in the sense of how much space you occupied in the universe, simply by virtue of being there and being difficult to ignore. Certainty of precedent, still holding at 52,000 kilometers, and still waiting for sanctum guidance that had been complicated by the ongoing transfer prohibition flag, detected the fleet's emergence and went to what the Verith called anticipatory readiness, which was not combat readiness. It was the posture of an instrument encountering a situation for which it had no good protocol. Coordinator Vethanassel stood at his forward display and looked at 4 Earth Fleet vessels arranged in the specific geometry that said, "We are here. We are not leaving. We would prefer to talk. But we have thought through the alternatives, and we are prepared for those too." He had been waiting for 11 days. In 11 days he had received 3 partial responses from the Sanctum, all requesting additional information about the transfer procedure, none authorizing any action. He had run the scan returns on the human station 407 times. He had cross-referenced the electromagnetic signature against every record in the Verith medical database. The signature was genuine. The scaffold was correctly architected. The neural map was human. He had established that early. It was the one anomaly. But the procedure being run was, in every technical sense, a Verith continuity transfer, adapted for a human substrate. He had spent 11 days sitting with that. He was a senior Verith coordinator. He had enforced the exclusion meridian for 14 months with the clean certainty of someone who understood where the categories were and which side of them everything fell on. And now, the categories had shifted. Not because the humans had argued against them. Not because they had pleaded or petitioned or filed documentation with the conclave in the approved formats. They had simply done something he hadn't expected. Something that didn't fit. He thought, in the privacy of his own processing, which Verith did not call thinking exactly, because their internal language had a different word for it, a word that implied something closer to navigation. He thought about the worker who had been on the outer hull. He thought about the 11 hours. He thought about what the humans called an emergency and what his protocols called a documentation matter. He was not sure now that he had been entirely right. This was not a comfortable navigation. He was not accustomed to it. Admiral Osi's first communication to certainty of precedent was short. Coordinator Vethanassel, "I'm told you've been waiting for guidance from your sanctum for 11 days. I'd like to talk while you wait. I think we may have some things to clarify about what's been happening on that station." A pause. "I'd also like to arrange safe passage for the station personnel to a human jurisdiction vessel. All 16 of them. We can work out the larger questions from there." Vethanassel rested the message. He read it 3 times, which was 1 more time than he usually needed. Then he authorized the passage. They brought Carl out of the scaffold housing at hour 42, 2 hours past the planned window. Because Haas had wanted to complete a full cycle run, and because Carl had said he didn't want to stop before the data was complete. He sat up slowly, with Mira's hand under his arm, and Haas monitoring the readouts and Vera standing back because she understood that some moments required space. His feet touched the floor. He stood. He stood without the brace. Haas had asked him to try, just try, as an assessment, and he was unsteady, the kind of unsteady that comes from relearning something your body used to know, and he put his hand on the housing to steady himself. His left hand. He looked at it. The hand was still, not perfectly still. There was a slight tremor, residual probably would be for a while, but it was the tremor of exertion, not degeneration. It was a different kind. He stood there for a moment just looking at his own hand. Then he said, without looking up, "I know this might not hold. I know we don't know the long-term prognosis. I know Haas needs months of assessment, and I know," he stopped, swallowed. "I know all the cautious things. I just need a minute." Nobody said anything. The station breathed around them. Somewhere in the distance, the navigation display was showing 4 Earth fleet vessels and 1 Verith cruiser holding at respective positions, and a channel open between them, and words moving back and forth that would, in time, resolve into something other than what the last 3 years had been. Mira handed Carl a cup of water. This was the kind of gesture that didn't require explanation. "Here, drink this. You've been lying still for 42 hours. You need water." Carl took it with his left hand and held it without shaking and drank it. They were transferred to F's meridian break 14 hours later, all 15 of them, moving through a temporary connector tube in the order Vera had arranged. The injured first, then the engineers, then Haas with his data core copy and his notebook full of illegible observations, then Carl and Mira side, then Vera last, as was her habit. She paused at the connector, one hand on the frame, and looked back at Cradle Station. It was, objectively, a terrible-looking structure, a decommissioned ore freighter with modules bolted on in configurations that had made sense under necessity and looked chaotic from the outside. The running lights were wrong. The hull plating was mismatched. The communications array that Carl had spent half a year keeping functional was still slightly crooked from the pulse that had knocked Yusuf loose. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went through the connector. Admiral Osi met her in the receiving bay. A tall woman with a career's worth of careful behind her eyes and a handshake that implied, "I have read your message and I understand exactly what you did." She did not say this out loud. She said, "Commander Solis, welcome aboard." And then quietly, "We got your message on day 1. It took 8 days to arrange the response without triggering a conclave alarm before we were in position. I'm sorry it wasn't faster." "You got here before the deadline," Vera said. "That's enough." Osi looked at her for a moment. "The negotiation is going to take time. The Vareth have already flagged the neural transfer procedure as a violation of their prohibition framework. They claim you used it manipulatively. We used it to stay alive." "I know." Osi's expression was something that lived close to a smile without committing to it. "I also know that what Dr. Haas ran on that scaffold isn't just a Vareth procedure anymore. His notes have already been reviewed by 3 people on this ship, 2 of whom have relevant expertise, and they all had the same reaction I think you're used to by now." Vera waited. "It's not theoretical anymore," Osi said. In the medical bay of F's Meridian Break, Haas was already at a terminal, translating his illegible handwriting into something the ship's medical system could work with. Carl was there too, sitting on an examination table, submitting to assessment with the patient cooperation of someone who had been assessed many times, and understood that the data mattered more than the comfort. Mira was there because she had decided she was staying there, and no one had argued. The preliminary assessment would take 4 hours. The full picture would take months. But Carl was sitting on the examination table, with both feet flat on the floor and his left hand in his lap, and when the assessor asked him to flex and extend the fingers, he did it slowly and completely, and looked at his hand while he did it with an expression that was not joy exactly, because joy implies certainty, and certainty was not available yet. It was something more tentative. Something that knew it might be wrong, and had decided to feel it anyway. He had a playlist on his comm unit. He hadn't listened to it in a while. He would listen to it later, he thought, when there was time, when the assessment was done, and Haas had his data, and the negotiation was in whatever stage it was going to be in, and the station was behind them, and the question of what came next was something other than survival. He would listen to it then. Outside the viewport, the Jovian shadow was still thick with Vareth enforcement infrastructure. The sensors, the transit markers, the cold invisible architecture of a border drawn by a civilization that had decided humanity's urgency wasn't worth sharing. The exclusion meridian was still there. The negotiation would be long. The conclave would resist. There would be more incidents, more documentation, more years of being told that ungerminated things should wait their turn. But certainty of precedent was sitting at 52,000 kilometers, with a channel open and a coordinator, who had spent 11 days unable to categorize what he was looking at. And Earth fleet, fur vessels in the Jovian shadow for the first time in the history of the exclusion, and the humans who had built a station from a broken freighter in the gap between lanes had 11 days ago, made the largest military intelligence service in the known conclave hesitate with 40 hours of scanner noise and a man willing to lie still in a medical housing and be the evidence. Vera Solis stood at the viewport for a long time. Then she went to find coffee, because the negotiation briefing started in 2 hours, and she wanted to be functional for it. She was not by nature a woman who went in for speeches or declarations, or the sort of internal monologue that circumstances sometimes seem to demand. She did not think, "We showed them." She did not think, "We won," she thought. "We're still here and now they know it, and that changes the math." That was enough. For now it was enough. She found the coffee. She drank it. She went to the briefing.